We're good. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Nick Cullather. I'm the Associate Dean here at SGIS. And let me say a little bit before we begin about the organization of the conference. Each of the panels, except for this one, is built around a research cluster that the center is interested in engaging in. And I'll allow each one of the chairs of each of those panels to explain the extent and meaning of those clusters. But this is kind of a step toward coming up with a scheme of organization for the Tobias Center and an agenda for work in the future. This panel, however, was occasioned by a specific anniversary and a set of recent events. It is the 15th anniversary of the beginning of the US aid program, the UN aid program, the Red Cross's aid program in Afghanistan. So it's a time to look back at 15 years, and it's also a time to look forward. The president has committed the United States to remaining in Afghanistan for an indefinite period of time. In those 15 years, the United States has committed more money to aid and reconstruction in Afghanistan than to any single nation in the United States' history. Over $117 billion. $70 billion of that has been in the security sector, with the remainder divided between energy, healthcare, education, housing, and state building. There have been some substantial gains during that 15-year period. Infant mortality is down, lifespans are up, school enrollments have expanded. There is a special inspector general of the US aid program in Afghanistan who writes a quarterly report, and they're worth reading. They're all published online. But he nonetheless, despite these gains, paints a bleak picture. Quote, a dangerous and stubborn insurgency controls or exerts influence over areas holding about a third of the Afghan population. Heavy casualties and capability gaps limit the effectiveness of Afghan soldiers and police. Opium production stands near record levels. Illiteracy and poverty remain widespread. Corruption reaches into every aspect of national life. The rule of law has limited reach. Multiple obstacles deter investors and complicate business operations. The ranks of the jobless grow as the economy stagnates. And so it's a bleak picture, but to Americans, and in fact, in the world of development, it's not an unfamiliar picture. The coincidence of aid with conflict has been a constant, really, throughout the years in which the United States and other countries have been engaged in aid. And so attempting to build a nation while conducting a counterinsurgency is development at its toughest. But it's a phenomenon that we should study, that we should take note of. And our panel today is to examine the unique trade-offs and dilemmas that development practitioners face in these trying situations. To help us understand this, we have an outstanding panel of experts from a variety of different fields. With us is Jennifer Fluri, a geographer from the University of Colorado. Her research interest is in gender, geopolitics, and international aid and development. Her study, The Carpetbaggers of Kabul, examines women's rights activists, community leaders, and civil society peace-building activities in Afghanistan. To her left is Timmy Kalinowski. He can help us gain a longer perspective on state building by drawing a comparison between the Soviet and the American interventions. His book, The Long Goodbye, is the best treatment that I've read of the efforts to modernize and stabilize Afghanistan under Soviet occupation. He comes to us from the University of Amsterdam. We're particularly honored to have with us General David M. Rodriguez, commander of the International Security Assistance Force, a 44-country coalition providing security in Afghanistan during the larger portion of the Obama administration, am I right? Greg Jaffe of the Washington Post said, "No US general has spent more time in Afghanistan than General David M. Rodriguez." He has been a trusted advisor to Defense Secretary Robert Gates, a name that I'm always pleased to mention because he's one of our alums. And until recently, he was commander of the US Africa Command, and so he's able to give us a comparative perspective on another critical world area as well. And then to my far left is Abdulkader Sinno, Associate Professor of Political Science and Near Eastern Studies here in the School of Global and International Studies. He's been a Carnegie Scholar and a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he is the author of Organizations at War in Afghanistan and Beyond. Jennifer, let me begin with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about the interviews that you've conducted with aid workers, community activists, and local community leaders in Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit first about the nature of that research and about what it might tell us about the lessons they perceive from the experience of the last 15 years.
Okay, thank you. So, well, thank you for having me here, first of all. And so I began the research on the international aid community and the local Afghan aid community in Kabul in 2006. Basically, I'd been going to a number of different conferences that were focusing on Afghanistan and met a number of aid and development workers. And several of them actually, as we got talking, suggested that I do research on what was happening in Afghanistan at that time. And I was like, okay, I was looking for a new project. I had just finished my dissertation and was doing my kind of postdoctoral research. And so what I ended up doing is I put together a study where I interviewed people working in the aid and development community and also several people that were involved in logistics companies and contractors. And so between 2006 and 2012, I went back and forth to Afghanistan several times to conduct that research. And what I found was sort of alarming, I guess, in some ways. And I had actually gone in with more of a naive sense of the US-led role in Afghanistan and had expected to find a much rosier picture than I did. And many of the aid workers and development workers that I interviewed were many of them were frustrated, and these were the ones that were frustrated and upset about what was happening there are the people that were there for long term, and long term meaning 3 or 4 years. Most people were there on yearly, cyclical 1-year contracts, and so the longer term people, I put them in kind of a different category. Many of them were very concerned about Afghanistan, had either themselves they were Afghan expats, or others had just really cared about the country and wanted to see it improve, and found that they were, particularly those who worked for the larger development organizations like USAID, but also Asia Foundation and DFID and various other international, both government and non-governmental organizations, found that they were being really pushed to write policy reports or write a report or take a quick snapshot of a school that they had built, even though there was no money or books or money for books or teachers or whatever. And so they felt like there was this sort of two visions of development that was happening. One was the sort of, picture Kodak moment, quick and success story that was being played out in the international media, and then the sort of realities on the ground. The other issue that really came out was the spatial, and I'm a geographer, so I was really interested in this kind of spatial distance between international workers and Afghans because of a lot of the security concerns. So many people, particularly again in larger organizations, were living in compounds, spent most of their time with other internationals in international restaurants and that sort of thing, and didn't really spend any time with Afghans, or very limited amount of time. And that was frustrating for them as well as it was for their Afghan counterparts. Like, they were prohibited to going into Afghan homes, and anyone who knows even a little bit about Afghanistan knows that it's an incredibly hospitable culture, and inviting people home is a really important part of that part of the culture. So that was another frustration. The other thing that was alarming that really was upsetting to Afghans was the quite literal spatial divide in international spaces, where Afghans were actually prevented from entering into international spaces, particularly restaurants that served alcohol, because it's illegal in Afghanistan, but that didn't stop people from consuming alcohol. And so you would go into these spaces and it would actually say foreign passport only. And so to be barred from a place, even if you don't want to go into it, but to be barred from a place in your own country was also quite upsetting to the Afghans that I was working with at that time. Other issues, as happens with a lot of, whether it's disasters or human-based conflict, it's like the best and worst of humanity comes to these places. And for example, there was an uptick in human and sex trafficking in Afghanistan that was basically catering to the international community. And so as a gender scholar, I was really interested in this focus, US-based focus on supporting and helping Afghan women, but at the same time, interviewing female international workers, all who had been sexually harassed or assaulted by other international workers. And then a number of Chinese, they were called Chinese restaurants, but they were actually fronts for brothels in Afghanistan. And then Chinese and Thai women were being either trafficked or even legally brought in as part of sex work in Afghanistan, and again catering to internationals. So those two multiple things were happening simultaneously in Afghanistan. The other interesting thing was the difference in salaries. So many international workers, and this is part of what I wrote about in my book, who I co-authored with a friend of mine who also was running an NGO for 10 years in Afghanistan, but very small scale and not getting the big dollars because of how they ran their NGO. Anyway, but there was this huge difference, and so many internationals that I interviewed that were there just for these quick contracts were making enormous salaries. And tax-free, because if you live out of the US for 11 months, you don't have to pay taxes on it either. So that was this kind of huge division between Afghans, who many were barely eking by, living even with a good sort of well-paying international job in the aid and development community, while international workers were making just tremendous amounts of money, both legally and also through their own sort of various forms of corruption. So, and that was, and I understood it in some ways, because a lot of it had to do with what's called danger pay and post-differential, which is spending an enormous amount of time out of the country, and so using money as a way to compensate people for putting their lives at risk, and also spending a tremendous amount of time away from their families, because as a conflict zone, it was a non-family and non-spouse post, so people had to be there alone. So I understood that, but it just created these this sort of an enormous division and lack of understanding of what Afghans were going through. Because at the time I was doing this research, I was staying in an Afghan guest house, and I spent a tremendous amount of time with Afghan families. And I saw like how difficult it was just to get to work for Afghans who, because of all of this international money coming into Kabul, the rents went up astronomically. They were like New York City style rent costs for housing. And so Afghans kept getting pushed further and further from the center sort of key parts of the city where all the embassies were and all the aid and development organizations were. And so it could take over an hour and sometimes longer because of gridlock traffic and just the difficulty of roads and living so far away to get to work, and then international employers not understanding why someone was late or why there was difficulty because they live and worked in the same place, and they were really just there to work and didn't, they were away from their families, and family life is incredibly important to Afghans, and so that was another sort of distance because they weren't able to have these kind of spatial connections because of security and distrust and all of those sorts of things. So the other interesting thing is many of the people I interviewed were there to resume build, basically. And this is, I think, part of the professionalization of what was brought up in the earlier today of this sort of, development industrial complex, right? So you had a lot of young people who had, newly minted master's degrees in international development who were just really putting like, I was in Afghanistan, that's the line on my resume, with hopes that later they would get a better job, maybe in New York or Geneva or somewhere, more pleasant, as they would say. So, that was another part of seeing how development work wasn't so much directed towards Afghanistan, but was directed towards people's personal goals and personal initiative. And just as what was brought up in the last panel, I kept shaking my head because so many people too wanted to put their mark on their project. So they would start a project, and then the next year I would come back and it would be a different person, and they wouldn't continue the project of the last person that was there. They want to start their own project and put their own mark on it, right? And sort of this kind of frenzy we are all, and a lot of young people are in today, where we're all sort of, you're all building up your own resumes and your own like mark on the world, and everyone wants to start something new instead of work on something that's already been built up by someone else. So that was another big on the negative side. So I should say something positive maybe, but anyway. On the positive side, I would say what I ended up focusing on and how I found this organization, Rubia, and my friend and now colleague, Rachel Lair, who co-founded that organization, was some of the smaller scale development. So people that were in Afghanistan not to make money, not to resume build, not to get some cushy job in the development world, but because they actually cared about Afghans, or they had friends who were Afghans, or they came there because they had friends in the US who were Afghans and they wanted to help them and their families. And I found those projects to be incredibly inspiring and, but also very difficult because they didn't often meet the geopolitical imperative of, whether it was saving Afghan women or educating people in a particular way that met Western standards or whatever. These projects were really working with Afghans on their terms in their communities and not trying to socially engineer gender roles or not trying to socially engineer how the existing systems were working, but actually working within those systems. And for example, using Islam as a way of improving gender relations, right? Showing how certain customary practices in Afghanistan are actually haram in Islam or forbidden in Islam, and rather than saying this is a violation of international rights law, which didn't have currency or understanding locally. So those organizations were really amazing in what they were able to accomplish, but and they would actually joke that they weren't corrupt because they didn't have enough money to be corrupt, because they had a hard time getting funding because they didn't meet this image that the US-based geopolitics and US media had really created about Afghanistan, the sort of mythology of what we were doing there, or what we wanted to do there potentially, but wasn't working because there wasn't an understanding of the society and the culture in a way that met Afghans on their terms and was willing to understand how things were working, right? It was just, so many people went in there and just assumed, we're starting at ground zero quite literally in Afghanistan, even though that's, there are systems and there are ways in which society was functioning and working despite all the conflict of many decades. And not that aid isn't important and development doesn't need to happen, but it can happen better. And I guess, sort of looking at some of these smaller scale projects and what they were able to accomplish on very, very little funding, I think is a way to potentially teach the larger, much better funded organizations on, where they failed and where they could potentially improve.
It's a lot to chew over there, particularly the difference in motivations of aid workers, and then this clash that you point to between the work itself and the appearance one wants to project about the work. And on that point, I want to ask Artemy a question about the Soviet intervention. In reading your book, I came away with an impression, and I don't know whether you would agree with this or not, that the Soviets actually had a lot of advantages over us. Do you feel that that's true?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure it did them a lot of good in the long run, but you know, the thing, if you go back to 1979, one, of course, they're intervening in Afghanistan that has a fairly strong state, certainly compared to 2001. But it's also a country where they've been involved continuously alongside the Americans from the 1950s up to that point. So there's a lot more local knowledge, right? That's one advantage. The other advantage that they have is, of course, Soviet Central Asians, ethnic Tajiks, Uzbeks, who serve in the military, who serve in the intelligence services, who serve as translators. And so they're very quickly, after intervening, once they realize they're going to be there for a while, they're able to put this to work, not just in terms of helping the military, but also in terms of how they try to kind of go about pacification. And a few years ago, I met an anthropologist who's worked there for 3 decades, Gilles Donatero. And I asked him, what was your impression as a professional anthropologist? And he said, I was always convinced that the Soviet intelligence services had the best ethnographers because of how well they were able to kind of pinpoint, who was power in a certain area, how you can try to bring that person in and get them to bring their followers in. So they had these advantages, absolutely. At the same time, they had a lot of the same problems that we see after 2001, right? On the one hand, you would think, okay, this really isn't a centralized intervention, right? There's one Soviet military, essentially one kind of organization overseeing all of the aid programs, and yet you have the same problems of coordination, the same problems of competition between different groups, the same problems of, not the same, but analogous problems of inefficiency, and ultimately, very quickly, quite a bit of cynicism and alienation between the kind of foreign, the Soviets who come in and the people they're trying to work with. So in that sense, yeah, that disadvantage is quickly worn out. And the other side of it is that, of course, the Soviets are known as a atheistic state, right? As a state that quite openly proclaimed itself, at least in earlier periods, to be very much against the values that a lot of people held dear. And the Soviets recognized that and very quickly tried to counter it. It's very interesting. If you recently, kind of finishing up my second book, I was looking for photos, and if you go through Soviet photo archives looking for photos of Central Asia, in the 1980s, you suddenly get all of these photos of Afghan delegations visiting Soviet mosques, right? And that's very much a part of a concerted kind of propaganda program to show that actually the Soviet Union is friendly to Islam. The other thing is that this cultural understanding that the Soviets have or think they have, it's one thing when it's kind of acquired over time by anthropologists or Soviet ethnographers, who, by the way, a lot of the best Soviet intelligence officers were trained by these ethnographers, which is how this information gets kind of used. But it very quickly becomes reified in the context of counterinsurgency. So very quickly you have this kind of split where you have, weirdly, it happens almost institutionally. You have the kind of military intelligence, which really favors working with Tajiks and says, these are the people, and more generally kind of bringing minorities into the government and trying to establish peace that way. Whereas there's another interpretation which says Afghanistan is a Pushtun country, and any state you're going to build, you have to build around a strong Pushtun-led government. And this is the line the KGB produces. And so you have these completely ridiculous instances of the two of them trying to undermine each other as they're trying to kind of build one or another peace plan, right? So this knowledge very quickly it's not just misused, but it's reified, and the consequences are quite dire. And then in the longer run, and this is kind of, I think, maybe, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but the the worst kind of similarity is that you know, the Soviets realized from the beginning that this is not a war you win by firepower alone. And on the one hand, they always expect that, okay, you know, a little bit more development work, a little bit more of this reconciliation work, and you know, then we can pull back the forces. At the same time, this constant frustration at the level of local commanders, but even more senior leadership, you know, their sense that they can't quite understand Afghanistanis, that they can't communicate with them, this kind of trope that develops that they're not trustworthy, and so on and so forth, and that they can't stop arms from flowing in, leads to kind of more and more willful use of violence, often unsanctioned beforehand, but tolerated afterwards. And I think that's not something that's, you know, unique to the Soviet occupation, the American experience. That's something that's unfortunately quite typical of counterinsurgency and development when they go together.
Very interesting observations. Particularly, I want to highlight that one about the tension over what kind of a country are we trying to build? Are we building a multi-ethnic country, or are we building a Pashtun state? That's a very interesting observation. General Rodriguez, you've had the opportunity to work with a number of governments at a very high level on very similar issues. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Afghan government as a partner. And perhaps if you could make some ups. I think we need to stipulate, because I've heard 2 apologies already, that we are going to make some pessimistic observations during the course of this panel, and we should not need to apologize for that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the nature of them, of that state as a partner, and the particular challenges it poses.
Well, the Afghan government, you know, I always laugh about when the international community went to Bonn, and I think in the 20 years, for the first 20 years of Afghans' existence after the Bonn conference, they were supposed to have 17 national elections. So could you imagine if we did that in our country? So, so understanding, you know, Afghans, Afghan culture, and how they work is hugely important. And I'm not sure the international community did that as they went to Bonn and came up with 17 national elections to include the local elections, which they do local elections a little different than we do, and they're kind of like raise your hand and how many of the leadership of the local communities do it, but we want to impose a government on them. So they recoiled from that from the very, very beginning of the international effort. But the question about the Afghan government, you know, we had a lot of Afghan leaders who were weak and corrupt that were interspersed throughout all levels of the Afghan government. And sometimes the money and the infusion of money that you talked to actually made that worse, because we were made the mistake of, because we didn't understand who the good leaders were and the bad leaders were as well as we should have, we actually empowered some of the bad leaders. And I think that sometimes with all that money there, I said, you know, everybody was really frustrated with the warlords and their influence. And, you know, I used to laugh at everybody who would come in and say, I don't know why Karzai can do this, you know. I can't do this, it's simple and everything. I said, boy, we have a hard time with 2, you know, warlord parties, and he has about 8 that if he can't convince 6 of them, he's going to be in trouble for different things. And so everybody was concerned about the warlords, but the longer I was there, I got as much concerned about what I called money lords. And those money lords were created many times by the international assistance, to include the U.S. military too, who created some unknowingly that created some problems. So I think everything in the development arena, everything in the security arena also has a huge governance impact and interaction, so that if you don't understand the interaction of the people, the government, and the security forces, we can make some bad mistakes. So I think that we saw that with the government officials that we worked with. And then a great State Department colleague of mine said, the other thing that we are, you know, fooled by many times is whoever can speak English is who we work with. And that becomes a real challenge as you're working through these things, because we just didn't have a lot of speakers who could speak the 4 or 5 really key dialects that you have to. And so that Afghan governance and government and the government leaders had a huge impact on every single thing that we did or didn't do. And to your point also about the amount of money people got paid, you know, we spent a lot of money on the security forces. So you would go to a district government, district governor's office of a small district, and you know, the police chief was lined up with his 20 pickup trucks with machine guns, making twice what the district governor made for a salary. And the governor, who was district governor who's trying to work, it's got 2 broke down vehicles and a bicycle, and that's what he's doing his job with. So right away you have a power imbalance with some of the things that, again, you're trying to do good, but is creating problems. And then the Army was the same way. So they were getting paid more, they were getting armed more, they were getting taken care of much better than the government service workers, who at the end were dependent on to do that. And then your point about the local piece that you brought up, and there are millions of wonderful local projects happening and work very, very good. But it's not connected, it's not linked. And I'm reminded of what the Vietnamese colonel told Harry Summers, that, you know, we won every battle, but we lost the war. And that's like that in the development community, in that they have thousands of good projects happening at the local level all over the place. But if it's not linked into the government and it's not linked into the entire effort there, that you're going to be a little bit more disconnected than you think you would. Thank you.
It's a very interesting point about the scale of operations, that it's maybe easier and better to put together a small-scale operation, but it doesn't serve the overall nation-building needs. I want to take this point of corruption and pass it to Professor Sinno with apologies. You know, it used to be the case that development experts talked in a different way than they do now about corruption. Now the kind of gold standard of anti-corruption is transparency. But if one looks back at the 1950s and a number of quite successful development programs, South Korea, Taiwan, they weren't particularly interested in stamping out corruption. They just wanted to make it predictable. And I'm wondering if there are some ways we can think about, and there was academic research to kind of back this up. James Scott wrote a famous book called Comparative Corruption, where he looked comparatively at corruption in different countries around the world, and found that, you know, some corruption is actually really terrific for economic development, and other corruption isn't. And what we've got, you know, it's not about eliminating corruption, it's like getting the right corrupt people, and getting them to do corruption in the right way. And I wonder if you have any thoughts for us on the peculiar nature of Afghan institutions, the particular nature of Afghan institutions, and corruption as a problem.
It's a great question. The first thing to realize is that corruption in Afghanistan on many levels is rational. It doesn't mean it's right, but it's rational. Let's go back to the example that General Rodriguez mentioned, where the district manager doesn't make much money. Well, where is he going to get his money? He's tempted to cooperate with drug traffickers and the Taliban in the drug enterprise that can generate lots of profit. Judges are not paid very well in the Afghan system. That's why you only win in an Afghan court if you pay more than the other party. If we go look back at how we try to build Afghan institutions in general, we find that over the longest period of years, of times, until very recently, Western countries, the NGOs, have directly funded branches of the administration. They call them consultants, about 6,000 of them in different branches of the Afghan government. They were highly paid and beholden to the donors, not to the Afghan government they're supposed to serve. They adopted their donors' cultures. They wanted to please their donors, do the job the way the donors understood it. Now, if you are an Afghan official who are not one of those consultants, the lowly paid, the lowly underpaid one who's beholden to the government and the chain of command of the government, what do you do to even the treatment? You ask for bribes. Now, that's part of the consequence of how we went about state building in Afghanistan. Let's look at other areas where the corrupt are actually foreigners, including Americans, contractors. Now, if you are a contractor doing a logistics job or any other job that requires of you to go through dangerous areas of Afghanistan to serve the DoD or any other agency that pays for that contract, what are your priorities? Whom are you beholden to? First, shareholders, because you're a profit-making corporation. Second, the safety of your personnel, because if they're hurt, they may revolt against you, and also it will raise the cost of insurance. So the incentive is there for you to pay off local leaders who themselves deal with the Taliban to preempt attacks on the convoys, to guarantee the next contract. In fact, the DoD itself, as we were discussing earlier, estimates that about 10% of the money spent on logistics contracts ends up in the hands of the Taliban. Is that accurate? I'm not sure, but certainly it's a substantial amount. And when you consider that the Taliban in Afghanistan operated in the past during the surge at 1,000th the budget of the United States, of the coalition in general, this is an immense amount of money that served them quite well and diversified their income beyond drugs and local taxation and other sources. So the corruption itself is rational. It's not right, but it's rational.
You might have noticed that I'm keeping a list of potential research topics that the center can undertake, and I've just added the word contractors to that. But I want to look back at our panel this morning and throw to you a couple of observations or questions that came up during that panel that perhaps we can talk about a little bit. One is the question of language. The observation was made that the language that we use to talk about development, the language of donors, recipients, of models, of progress in certain ways, is both inadequate and wrong and also insulting to people in other countries. I'm just wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that issue. Is there a kind of communication problem within the development community itself where the language we use to describe these projects is part of the problem?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in Afghanistan, like capacity building was a buzzword that was used so much. Like we need to build capacity, we need to build capacity. But what was often missed was the existing capacity that was there, right? And like Afghans have a tremendous amount of capacity. They've lived through, a tremendous amount of scarcity and war and conflict and all kinds of displacement and mobility. And that was never, or rarely, I would say, recognized. And so the capacity building projects often, and I know it was mentioned in the previous panel, were very paternalistic. And I even interviewed people who were like, it's a country run by 13-year-olds, like sort of this actually talking about adult Afghans as if they were children, which is incredibly insulting, and acting as if that because you're speaking in English and quickly or whatever, or you're in an international space, that somehow that isn't being conveyed was also untrue. I mean, that sentiment was being conveyed and was incredibly insulting. And so some of those, and pride and honor is also a huge part of the fabric of Afghan society. So and there even have been studies done that young men who have joined the Taliban or other insurgent groups, most of the time it was because they felt they were insulted. It wasn't for money and it wasn't for all these sort of other things we were assuming, but because their honor had been insulted by an international usually. So I think that the language is actually really much more important than I even realized as a development scholar, until I started doing this research.
Yeah, well, I typical academic thing. I'm going to say yes, but. and the thing that I want to say after the qualification is, of course, that language is always getting reused and translated in kind of strategic ways, right? So, I mean, for historians of the Soviet Union, right, we know that there was this process of learning to speak Bolshevik, right? And once you learn the language, you could use it strategically actually to do things very different from what the state wanted you to do, from the party wanted you to do. But that's the same, I think that's the same in a development kind of context. And so when I was doing research in Tajikistan, I was for a while, I was also kind of helping out an NGO that was working with USAID and World Bank and other organizations. So I'd spend half the day in the archive, half the day kind of doing, riding around in the white Jeep and kind of seeing things from that perspective. And it was, but I had a very good relationship with my coworkers, so I could see how they would just put on a mask, go into this meeting, right, and be able to use the language that was required of them, and not even necessarily get that angry about it, but talk about the metrics, talk about the results, talk about the commitment to democracy or anti-corruption or whatever, and then very openly reflect on why that had to be done and what the actual kind of use would be, right, and not necessarily seeing that as contradiction, but just part of the way that things work. And so I think that's what we have to remember, is that when the language is getting reproduced, it doesn't mean that it means the same things that we want it to mean.
Well, the language makes a big difference. I think the point that they brought up very clearly this morning was, this is about a partnership and support. I mean, we called the teams that worked with each of the provincial governors provincial reconstruction teams. And they're like, well, why do you call them that? They're not reconstructing Afghanistan, we are. We had colonels that were advisors to 3-star generals, and that just doesn't sound good, and that, again, is affront to their pride. So I think it's really important about to be a partner and to support their efforts. And, too many times we try to impose our system on them rather than just make their systems operate more efficiently and a little bit better. So I think that it makes a huge difference in the language and what you're trying to get done and how to do it. I mean, for years the military used to say, look, we need to put an Afghan face on this thing. And it just drove them crazy because they knew it was only a mask or a facade. And again, that gets at their pride. It gets at they have a lot of pride, and they have lived and suffered through a lot of challenging times and everything. And we're saying, just put an Afghan face on, everything will be better. I mean, it was such an affront to a bunch of great young men and women. So I think language is a big part of it.
I'll add a little bit to the conversation, talk about the consequence of that language as well. As part of this groupthink that emerged was a perception or the attitude that Afghans are really not that rational, they're not as strategic, unable to adjust to whatever we're trying to impose. In the military sphere that also touched on development, there was the term hearts and minds, for example. Now, listen, let's just preface this by saying in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we had some of the brightest generals in the field we ever had in any war in history. However, that term was misused. And it was developed originally by the British in Malaya and Kenya during the colonial era, and it was adapted to a specific context where the organizations they were fighting, whether it was the communists in Malaya or others, were isolated from the social structure. So you could try to isolate them and then pay money, punish those who support them, and pay money to those who agree not to support them to keep them in your camp. Now, the problem is that in Afghanistan, the Taliban are intertwined with the social structure in areas of conflict. They are kith and kin of those living in the villages. In every village, you have supporters of the Taliban. And so you can't really isolate the Taliban when they're intertwined with social structure. But we had the fantasy that we can buy their hearts and minds, and that's a term that get a life of its own, by giving some money here, building a school there, building a road here, whatever. And of course, if you are an Afghan local leader and the nice second lieutenant or captain, whatever, comes to you and makes that offer, and they have money as they execute their weaponization of money approach, right? And they offer you that money, you cannot say no because there are consequences of that. You're signaling opposition to the United States and the coalition, and that's dangerous. And you take it, but what's your next logical strategic step? You go to the Taliban folks in the neighborhood, or those who are supporters of them who can inform them, and you give them 20%. To tell them, sorry, I could not refuse, but I didn't do it because I want to do. Let's benefit our community with the remaining 80%, and please take this to show my support to you. The whole idea of hearts and minds as understood by the military and others who were behind, the politicians, assumed that it would just work magically. The Afghans will be grateful, and they will fall in line. And that's part of the consequence of the hubris of using the wrong words.
Let me take another point that was raised by Dr. Dybel this morning. He pointed to an interesting paradox that has to do with goal setting. That it's absolutely imperative for organizations to have goals. But the goals themselves are useless. This is something that I think the military understands better than aid organizations and other bureaucracies do. I think it was Eisenhower who, before D-Day, said, you know, the plan's good until the first soldier hits the beach. So there's the paradox. How do you, in a situation in which you recognize that the goals and metrics have profound limitations, how can you use goals and metrics in an effective way, or are they usable? So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd really be grateful for it.
I mean, I can do the historian thing again. Take us back a few decades, but you know, back in the 1960s, the economist Albert Hirschman was hired by the World Bank precisely to study this question: is how can you know, what kind of process can you devise so that you can measure the effect of development projects? And he wrote this wonderful essay, which he called The Hiding Hand, which basically said the metrics are going to be pointless. Right? The point is you commit to a project, and then there's going to be all sorts of problems that come up, and as you solve those problems, that's development. Right? So, you know, for example, you go to build a dam, and it turns out that you actually need a factory to produce something for the dam, and now you've built a factory, and then you need to train workers for that factory, and that's development, and the World Bank shelved it. Right? The World Bank said this is useless for us. They shelved this essay, and then he published it separately, and it's been kind of influential, but not, I think, in the development field itself. So I think there are certain situations where it makes sense to do that. I'm not sure whether, in the context of counterinsurgency, you know, you can take that kind of open-ended approach. I think General will probably speak to that.
One of the things that will always remain in my mind is the Kajikai Dam. But anyhow, one of the challenges many of the aid organizations have, and certainly the government ones, is how we allocate resources. And you know, the objective at the end of the year is to have all the money spent versus, you know, doing something that makes a difference long-term, that's sustainable, that grows some ability of the host nation to do things better for themselves. That's not what the metric is. The metric is, all the money spent at the end of the year, I'm good, give me some more.
Yeah.
So the ability to adjust and flex is very limited relative to what is needed in this type of environment. And the other thing is to adjust people's behavior, you really need some carrots and sticks. And a lot of it is the resourcing, and the flexibility is not quite there to really be able to say, oh, hold on a second, we're going to stop this because it's either corruption beyond, you know, what you believe is acceptable. And I think I did want to say only one thing about the corruption piece is when it changes the power structure, or when it influences the power structure that is the country's objective, I think that's where you cross the line. You know, some of the corruption in our country actually led to good things and changes. You know, so, and that would happen in most places. But if we're going to allow the corruption to occur where it changes the balance of power and who becomes more powerful relative to the country's objectives and where they want to go, I think that's when you cross the line where you really run into problems. Thank you.
Yeah. I would just want to add a little bit to that. Well, as far as the money, because there actually is a term called burn rate, right. which is used so ubiquitously in aid. I mean, I've been in USAID meetings, and people will be like, oh, well, you have to think about your burn rate. And what it means is how quickly you can burn through your budget. So when that's the goal, is burning through your money, not actually, when the goal is spending the money, not implementing the project, that is part of why people were just sort of chasing the money and making sure. So actually doing something more efficiently for less money wasn't rewarded, for example, And so those kind of situations were pretty ubiquitous throughout the big aid money world, and especially USAID. So I would also say, though, that I feel so much of what was happening or has happened in Afghanistan has been metric-driven and not people-driven, and not and even counterinsurgency. I mean, coin wasn't an initial. That's not how we started in Afghanistan. It was the hunt for Bin Laden, and it was more smart bombs before we had drones, and the campaign for development was really about social engineering, and then it was like, we're not nation building, and then we were nation building. So it was this kind of continuous switching back and forth, and always based on different metrics, but without the flexibility and without the ability to really sort of get to know the culture. And in fact, USAID started, just because a friend of mine was on that project, doing Afghan cultural pre-deployment training in 2011. So like 10 years in is when that started, so the counterinsurgency model, the human train system, the let's really try to understand Afghanistan, win hearts and minds, work with them, really came very late in the process. So it was like the last 6 years of the 15 now that we're in is when all of that started happening. And so I think timing where we are in Afghanistan now as a nation is also an outgrowth of bad timing, I think, in addition to some of these other missteps along the way.
I want to give a shout out to some people in the audience. We have with us the Purdue Afghanistan project, 4 faculty members from Purdue who work in agronomy and soil science, and who are doing work in bringing agricultural livelihoods and new technologies to Afghanistan. And sitting right behind them is Nazif Sharani, who is one of our experts on Afghanistan in the School of Global and International Studies. And Nazif, if you don't mind, I'd like to give you the first question. Because I know you got one.
First, my colleague here, Professor McNamara, tells me that these 3 gentlemen are from the Herat University faculty, not from Purdue. They're currently at Purdue.
Okay, all right. All right.
I just wanted to ask whether the goal of both Soviet Union as well as the United States in intervening in Afghanistan was development and nation building, or doing anything for the Afghans? Or was it to protect their own security concerns? What George Bush did was essentially a revenge attempt. He wanted to do something to Taliban because they had allowed people to come and hit us. If it was a security concern, which seemed to have been because we kept chasing Al-Qaeda for a long years, and development issue was non-existent or of no real concern. And if you look at the ratio of expenditure also, $1 trillion spent on war, 70% of the aid money, as Nick suggested, was spent on security. So the proportion of what supposedly went to development is negligible. And then the first thing, the question is whether the goals of these 2 countries in Afghanistan were security or development. I would love to hear that. And secondly, The metrics issue that has been raised. Whose metrics? Did any Afghan hear what their metrics might be? The other important issue is, I think you've raised, that there was very little cultural understanding of the country. For God's sake, Khalilzad was part of the team. Did he not know? And his team, cronies, and others who were with him for years and years, they didn't know enough about Afghanistan? Or if they knew, then what was the impact of their knowledge as it translated into policy? Those are, I think, the important issues that one has to look into, and I think Nick's suggestions that we're looking for topics to research, to do development research, maybe those are the important things that we should be looking for. And I would really don't find being rationally immoral a very interesting explanation for anything. That people are doing rational things and because they're wrong and they're immoral. Does that make it right?
Those are great questions,
Fantastic.
Nazif. And we may have too many historians on this panel, I don't know. But let me give one more historical reference here, and that's to the 1960s and kind of the high point, or what's called the golden age of development. And in those days, that first question you asked would not make any sense, because there was an assumption that development itself was a kind of counterinsurgency. That there isn't counterinsurgency or development. Development is counterinsurgency. That, according to Walt Whitman Rostow, that the point of development is to make, ensure that societies which directly or indirectly threaten ours will not arise.
Right.
So let me throw this then to the panel and ask whether those two things have come unglued, either during the Soviet period or subsequently, whether it's still thought today that development is a kind of counterinsurgency.
Do you want to go first?
Let's go chronologically. Yeah, I mean, it's a very basic question. I mean, there's no doubt that the Soviets invaded for security reasons, and they were very, clear about that. There was no kind of. But here's the thing: any, I think, intervention, any counterinsurgency is going to reflect the country's values and habits and rationales, right? And so for the Soviets, the reason that they do something that actually looks very much like what we would call kind of coin or development in coin, is because that's the way they're used to running things, right? If people are unhappy, that's because they don't have electricity, or they're not getting water, or they don't see the point of the government, right? So if you want to stop them from rebelling, you have to do development. But at the same time, I wouldn't quite agree that they were always coupled, because actually the Soviets were doing development in Afghanistan from the 1950s and never expected to have to fight there, at least until very late in the 1970s. It also became, I mean, the whole kind of reason for existence of the Soviet regime, right? The whole kind of understanding of history and what a government is supposed to do was development. So that was just a natural thing that followed. But as for the intervention itself, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that it was a security concern.
There is a substantial difference between how the Soviets used development and the United States did. The United States tries to do it in areas that are contested. The Soviets focus on the areas of control. It's a bit of a different issue. And in both cases, there is development that's meant towards this dual purpose. First, like developing the ring road, for example, which, by the way, is one of the great failures in American history. The Soviets did it in 1 year. The United States and the coalition took about 7 years because of contracting. They contracted out to others who subcontracted it for political reasons, right? And then to the point where ultimately it's locals or Turkish companies or Chinese companies had very limited resources to build something substantial and meaningful. And it spoiled very quickly after building it. Anyway, so there are different ways the two were associated together under the coalition, in the coalition experience and the Soviet experience. And yes, I mean, the first things Professor Charlie said were absolutely correct. The United States has been very transparent in some ways about what it's doing in Afghanistan and why it's doing it. I mean, except for some the diplomatic statements, right? You know, it's pretty clear. And that's actually part of the reason why some of the unsavory behavior we see among Afghan officials is rational. Because they compare what's happening with the coalition with what happened with the Soviets. There is a historical context here. They know there will be an end game, and at some point the American system will get the United States to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. So what do you do when you know there's an end game? Do you invest in the institution, or do you invest in yourself? Appropriate as much as you can. You know, what do you realize? Do you dissolve patronage networks, hoping that the state will replace them for you? Or do you cultivate them because you know that this will be your means of protection and survival when everything breaks apart? So patronage makes sense in that context. Now, of course, towards the end, Professor Sharani threw me off a little bit. I never said it's right to be corrupt. I just was saying it was rational, even though it's not right, of course. But the bigger point is not this. It's not a moral issue we're discussing right here. Is what has been done so wrong to lead individuals who are rational and strategic to become corrupt? What could have been done differently? And that's a big, important topic, certainly worth of research.
Yeah, I would also add that the cultural piece, I think, can't be underestimated. I mean, it's so huge, and it was something that was completely left out. But going back also, I'm not a historian, but the change in sort of U.S. Kind of geopolitics around development, you know, after the end of the Cold War. I mean, Mark Duffield's work and Jamie Essex, who's a geographer, has written extensively on this. I mean, they really show that USAID had to prove its relevance, right? It had to show that there was a need for it, because prior to that, Soviet and US, in addition to all the hot wars that were happening, the part of the Cold War was who could do development better, who could get what parts of the so-called third world on their side, right? And so when that ended, this coupling between security and development really became part of how USAID proved its relevancy to Congress, you know, to continue to be funding, even though its budget is actually quite small compared to other parts of the government. And so, and since that time, you really see this kind of increasing coupling of security and development, and which is why it's so expensive, as you mentioned. I mean, you have these development organizations that pay tremendous amounts of money for private security. I mean, private security is a huge amount of wealth creation, actually, in Afghanistan. And then they're mostly international companies. They're not even Afghan run, you know. And so, I mean, they're bringing Gurkhas from Nepal in to be security guards. Why? It's Afghanistan, you know. I mean, you know, those kind of issues where and to the point where in Afghanistan, particularly in Kabul, because there's so much money there, there's this whole auxiliary economy that was generated where you have, you know, Kyrgyz and Uzbek and Tajik hairdressers there, you know, doing the hair of female international workers because they can make more money there than they can in their home countries. I mean, that's the extent of how much wealth was being generated and really going into international pockets and not so much Afghans. And the moral question, I do think that's important because so much of the behavior of internationals that they themselves would admit they would never do at home, but they did in Kabul because it was just part of the scene, you know, Afghan scene among the internationals. Really, that's what got communicated as democracy. That's what got communicated as development. And so many families that wanted to send their kids or one of their daughters to work in the international community decided not to because they were afraid that they would be participating in that immoral behavior. And this is everything from drug abuse to alcohol abuse to, as I mentioned, sexual abuse and promiscuity. That it's just not something that's accepted in the culture. And for many of the internationals, wouldn't be how they would behave in their own home countries. You know, so that issue that we don't ever really talk about, you don't even hear that ever in the news, I think is something that we should talk about more. Like, what is and I was saying at lunch, actually, that in some ways the military, at least they have honor and duty and a code of conduct, and you don't have that among the international workers, particularly all the contractors and logistics and people who really are there just for the paycheck and they're stakeholders, as you mentioned before.
I think that your first question, was it security or for development? I think that there was some confusion on that throughout the time and over the years because, you know, the objective of all of it is to really help them build a stable country, you know, that's not a problem for our security in the region are, you know, bad things. And, because everybody argued about the means and what it was going to cost and all that, I think we changed over time, and it was a continual question in everybody's mind from, you know, from the top all the way down, what were we really doing? And I think that that has, you know, is really magnified when you get into the development piece, because if you're, you know, working with a corrupt government or government officials who are, you know, doing bad things with the money that are changing the power structures and those things, you have insecurity, so you're paying for development projects. I think the Coast Road was over $1 million per quarter mile or something. You know, I mean, I'm like, wow, that's got to be a gold-plated road, you know? So you just get into this, you know, reinforcing, you know, money that just gets out of control, and you know, everybody just kept going. I'm like, man, that's an expensive road. When I retire, I'm going to be a road builder in Afghanistan. You know? But it's so I think that nobody really bought into that the entire way through and kept it consistent all the way through. As far as why we have, you know, a leadership that has knowledge and understanding of Afghanistan, and why that didn't inform what we were doing, I don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question. But you know, again, you're torn by, as you mentioned, the 1 year at a time, going to build my resume, going to get something done. I'm going to get my project done in my 1 year here, and that being the driving factor versus what you're really there for, which is the, you know, at the end of the day, our objective is to work ourselves out of a job, right. You know, but that's not what they get rewarded on, or that's not how the budgets get allocated and everything. So it's a, you know, it's a little bit of goal displacement in that situation.
I see a student in a yellow shirt right here.
So numerous members of this panel have pointed out the various corruption problems faced within Afghanistan, particularly corruption within the Department of Defense, and how this led to funding funding directly going to the Taliban and al-Qaeda groups. I was wondering, particularly from your perspective, General, in your time in the ISAF, to what extent was the DoD aware of these kinds of activities, and what kinds of methods were implemented to stop this flow of funds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that everybody understood that. We actually, inside DoD and over at the headquarters there, established a task force that was, you know, primarily focused on corruption and how we were going to limit that. And then, but we, as an international community, had a hard time tracking and following the money and understanding what was really happening as it got further and further away from, you know, the first person you worked with. So I think that we had a hard time with that. But I think everybody understood it was going on, and we couldn't solve it as easily as we wanted to. Now there's been some good programs to do that better over time, but I don't think we've made a lot of progress in that area yet. Thank you. And again, for the U.S. military, now understand, development is not our strong suit. I mean, that's not what we do for a living, but we're forced to do quite a bit of that, you know, and I'm not sure that's in our major skill set there, but we did the best we could.
Kind of a knocking things down business. Right?
Yeah, well, you know, the military governance is a real good question for who does that and who's done that the best over the years and everything. So we'll see how that turns out. But because of the, you know, rebuilding a country when it's non-secure is tough business, and to turn that over to a bunch of development agency and civilians I'm not sure that's the best idea, but that's my personal opinion. You know, I mean, that's not what we did in Germany. We were there for 12 years as military governors, you know, and then the capacity of the State Department to do that was found lacking in Afghanistan when we couldn't get all the people over there. And again, then they went to the little contracts for a year to come over and do that. So I don't think we've come to grips with that as a nation right now, but that's just my opinion.
Professor McNamara.
So listening to comments on Afghanistan is interesting, but I'd like to go on record. Since 2001, I've spent 50% of my time in Afghanistan and never visited a brothel or a restaurant that served alcohol. And I have dozens of friends who have not. So the generalizations make it difficult to discuss things. And I think we've hinted at there were dual objectives of the US government in Afghanistan. Development was certainly one, but it may not have been the priority. And Purdue University has been extensively involved in human capacity building, primarily in agriculture. The first group of Afghans we brought over to the US for MS degrees were faculty members at Kabul University. We brought them here to get MS degrees in agriculture. When they came to the US, they did not have the equivalent of a US high school degree. So they didn't have the skills that they needed to provide education to students in Afghanistan so they could work in that economy. We also worked with the Ministry of Public Health and the Ministry of Agriculture, helping them build capacity to conform with World Trade Organization requirements. The people they had in charge of testing food for pathogens did not know how to use a microscope. So, some people had skills, but really people did not have very many academic skills. All of the people who were trained before the Soviet invasion were gone. And during the Soviet period, there weren't so many. So it's really a difficult place to work in. You not only have this mix of ethnic groups, you also don't really have much cohesion among the government. It's cobbled together from different ethnic groups, different political interests. And I guess what I see as a challenge is really understanding what policies we can do to invest in people to give them the power to work in their own country, to develop that country. And then while that's occurring, because that's a longer term objective, what can we do to work toward building stability so that they can be empowered when they get back?
Yeah, well, I apologize for speaking generally, but yeah, there was plenty of people that don't go to brothels or drink alcohol in Afghanistan that are internationals, and those were the ones I ended up concentrating on as far as like some of these smaller scale development projects or assistance projects that I thought were actually quite successful, but maybe weren't getting as much funding. And I agree, like there's tremendous amount of development and aid that has been needed, is needed in Afghanistan, and I think having more of the kind of connections that you have with the country, like people who actually care and want to have the long term rather than these yearly cyclical projects, is the way to go. And whether it's universities, and I've actually I've met a number of people who actually lost loved ones on 9/11 who started long-term projects in Afghanistan as part of their healing and feeling like they felt an affinity and a connection with people in Afghanistan based on a kind of shared grief. And those projects have been actually quite successful and have included bringing young Afghans to the US for either both undergraduate and master's level training. And so I do think that there are these sort of pockets of hope and really excellent projects. And in fact, I'm on a committee member for one of my graduate students who's been on a large, actually USAID funded project, but it's about capacity building for scientists to calculate climate change in Central Asia, and includes Afghanistan. And that project, I think, is working really well because they've built in a evaluation, and they're continuously interviewing the scientists to find out what is working, what skills are do they find actually useful in their own environments. And so I think doing some of that self-evaluation and organizations realizing when things aren't working to have the flexibility to switch it up is another way to make things more positive. Because I do think there are success stories, but General Rodriguez said, the problem is they're not connected, and the lack of coordination of I mean, there was I think at the height, there was about over 2,500 different NGOs operating just in Kabul. And so, you know, without a whole lot of coordination and no sort of more competition than coordination among these various groups. So I think that's maybe the missing piece. But I do think it's, you know, the sort of big development, meet the geopolitical, media agenda, if you will, is part of the problem that maybe in this time now that isn't so much, like we're not going for the, after the US invaded Iraq, and that didn't go well, then Afghanistan had to be the success story again. And so just sort of following the ebbs and flows of the media can really tell us a lot about how that really was driving some of the projects. Because most of the people that I would say are doing, not caring and drinking and participating in all that negative behavior were really those that were locked in their compounds and weren't engaging with the community. They weren't spending time learning about the culture, or learning the language, or anything languages, I should say, or anything like that. So I do think those long-term commitments, to me, it's about time and scale is really what would make things work better. Because and even academics, I have to say, like I'm one of the few geographers that has continued to study Afghanistan now that it's no longer an interesting topic, quote unquote, to so many people. So many academics flooded there because it was like, oh, everyone's talking about that, and then they move on to the next exciting topic, right? Instead of having those sort of long-term interests, I think makes a big difference.
Well, I think on your question on what the policy decisions and guidance and issues, I think the biggest one really is first and foremost is what are you trying to get done and what the objectives are, so that everybody understands that and we stay fairly consistent that, although we'll change the ways and the means over time. And then, we're not, I just think the money issue is a hard one. If you're just doing it by the way our budgets work now and the way people get rewarded for spending their budget, I think that's a bad policy in the long term. So I think we should figure out how to be more flexible, how to say, look, we're not going to spend this money because it's putting good money after bad, or doing things that are hurting the society and the interactions of the power bases of each of the people involved and that. And then, we just got to get everybody to understand that we're not trying to impose our way of life on them, that we're helping them live the way they want to better and make their systems work better. And on the alcohol part, I'll just say I saw alcohol about 20 times there, maybe 30, but we had a couple of our coalition partners, and then the rest of the time I saw it was in Afghans' homes.
Let's see, third row right here. No. Right down here, the student in the third row. Sorry.
We better hurry to get him in.
Hello, thank you everyone so much for being here. I'd like to ask everyone on the panel to reflect on a quote that my professor often says. She says in Afghanistan, there's a very thin line of difference between a municipal government and a militia group. And so I don't know if everyone agrees with that. However, I want to ask how that really plays out between interactions with international actors and local actors.
You can take that one.
Sure. Your professor is very accurate in a sense. It's a complicated story, though. Think about it for a second. I'll give you a few examples just to give you part of the image of the story. When NGOs need to have a project, especially showcase project in an area that's contested or dangerous, they hire a militia for protection. They're registered with the government as security contractors. There are plenty of them. But in fact, it's a local warlord who brought his guys with their weapons and corporatized them, basically. Okay, now, let's say the government falls apart, the Taliban comes in, there's civil war. He can't be a corporation anymore, it makes no sense. At that point, they are a militia. And he has complete control over that militia. And he has committed enough funds to be able to maintain it. And now imagine another situation. the Afghan local police, which was one of the silver bullets for the American government in Afghanistan. It was also, forgive me, a disaster. What it was all about is, well, you know what? We're having trouble creating an Afghan national police. Let's fund local leaders, and they know their communities, it's their communities, they care about their folks, and they will become the local police, and they will back us up when we need them. Well, the problem is that often it was done without understanding the local social structure, not understanding that that leader may be one of 2 or 3 or more even in the region, and that giving him support and the title and the influx of money will make him more powerful, and exactly. And so what does he do next? He goes and starts punishing his previous opponents with whom he had the balance of power of sort before. Therefore, we're creating a militia in a local context that, and once, even when the backing stops or the United States withdraws or what have you, they become a standalone militia as opposed to a member of the ALP, a nominal member of the ALP. So in a sense, yes. Also, in the beginning, when the United States started to create state institutions, it had to work with what was there. And so the government posts went to warlords of all sorts and all levels and what have you. And they had official titles and an influx of resources and money because of that, through the whole patronage system that was forming. There's still some of that. It has been diminished considerably, but there's still some of that. And, also, like many of the posts in the Afghan National Police, which is a national police, are often bought by local leaders who have the resources to buy them. So they can fund their folks and maintain what is in de facto a militia, even though they are officers in the Afghan National Police in some areas. And those folks, by the way, just so you know, have been found on many occasions to actually work with the Taliban, informing them about coalition movements in their areas. Why? Well, think of it for a second. It's rational. Again, I'm not saying it's moral. It's rational. Why? Because they have to sit on the fence between the two. What if the Taliban win their neighborhood again, their area again? If they didn't cooperate with them some, they would decimate them in revenge. So it's rational for them to have a foot in each camp. Here you go. So your professor was right.
I have to say I love those sort of questions from students. My professor says this. What do you think? There's an interesting implication behind that. The gentleman back here in the blue shirt and a red sweater.
We have a local author by the name of Doug Wissing. Some of you might have heard of. He wrote a book about Afghanistan called Hopeless but Optimistic. I wonder if you would comment on that.
Go ahead.
No, that's probably. I know Doug. He's a terrific writer. It's a great book. It's very easy reading on a very important topic. I highly recommend it.
Excellent. Well done. Yes, right here.
I apologize for not standing up and introducing myself this morning. So I made a little space. My name is Joe Ryan. I've been teaching with SPIA for the last couple of years, but in the interests of full disclosure, I will say that I am a retired Foreign Service officer from USAID. The place I've lived longest in my adult life is Islamabad, Pakistan, with Manila and Berkeley, California, slightly coming in second and third. I appreciated Professor Fluri making the point that USAID as an institution didn't have much choice about its engagement in Afghanistan after 2001. Nor did Foreign Service officers. I've never been to Afghanistan. I've seen it through the Khyber Pass, but I haven't actually been inside. Who were basically drafted to fill the Kabul mission. So the question here is, given the difficulties of the assignment and the outcomes, could there have been a different way of engaging U.S. capabilities in the development field in Afghanistan? And I will just, as an example, in Pakistan, the second time I was there, we found that our program was heavily impinged upon by Washington policy on Afghanistan. At one point, we had this crazy idea that we were going to focus all our assistance, a large assistance package, thanks to the Kerry-Lugar bill that passed in 2009, on just those districts from which it was deemed that fighters were being recruited to go fight in Afghanistan against US troops, as if we could do that. So in other words, we had this AFPAC policy that the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, at the time Holbrooke was pushing, a policy that I'd like to entertain people by saying that I think it's AFPACwards, in the sense that Pakistan is probably the more interesting area to actually do development work and could, the potential overflows of that. I mean, in other words, it's another way of engaging in the region. But the way we engaged in the sort of chords approach, if you know the Vietnam history in Afghanistan, what's the alternative?
Well, first of all, going back to sort of the cultural sensitivity, having that training start from the beginning, and also not being so afraid. I hate to say it, but I mean, there's this joke that I would hear a lot from Afghans when we would pass a military convoy, or these guys in their guns and flak jackets, and they would be like, "What are they so afraid of?" And so what from our perspective communicates authority and security was being communicated a lot as fear, and as why can't we all sit down and meet, and understanding some of the customary practices. I mean, not that the whole country is Pashtun, but Pashtunwali, understanding that meeting someone at their home, and the expectation is that you will be invited in even if you're an enemy, and the goal is to come to a solution. It's different than our way of doing things, but meeting Afghans at least even halfway, if not 75% or a full way on their terms, I think that would have gone a long way. And also on the gender piece, I mean, so many Afghan women I've talked to over the years, they were like, the burqa's not our issue, that's your issue, that's your problem. Whether we veil or not veil we have so many other issues and so many other concerns that weren't being, I think if we had taken some time to actually listen to what the needs were of men and women in those communities throughout the country, and also realizing it's an incredibly diverse country. And there are all these ethnic disputes, but I think we went with what we knew, which was, the Northern Alliance and former warlords, people who had committed war crimes during the Civil War, and so that also was, I think, not the best approach politically going forward, but without taking the time to actually understand the place and just sort of rushing in, because and just to remind everybody, we didn't start out as nation builders. We started out to find bin Laden, and as you mentioned, as a revenge for 9/11. None of the hijackers were Afghans. Let's remember that, I mean, so where we were geopolitically in 2001 is really different than where we are now. And it's sort of, we came to this sort of sensibilities, I think that, I mean, like, just COIN didn't start until Petraeus, so it was, so many of the things we learned late, if we had gone in with those sensibilities early, and there's a huge Afghan diaspora in the US, and they weren't being hired, they weren't being consulted upon, and I'm not saying that would have been, because there's also a lot of sort of problems between expat Afghans and local Afghans, and their sort of different ways of viewing things. So I'm not saying that would have been perfect, but at least we would have had a better understanding of what was happening. Yeah, but a lot of those folks weren't consulted. That's the thing, yeah. Yeah, and there was a huge... Yeah.
Well, I don't know anything about major development efforts and everything as far as, my skill set, but part of the thing, it seems to me, just listening to the people, is that what they want to see is a sense of fairness. And that, everybody is kind of getting their fair share of the development efforts, mainly from the state, initially who they expect that from, but really it ends up being the international community. So if you look at Pakistan, down to the southeast, and I think it's about $300 per family. The state supports them. If you look at it, Waziristan, it's $1.42. So, you know, it's not that I'm a socialist or anything, but it ought to be, they need to be some sense of fairness in what their government is providing them. And the Afghans of all people, from my perspective, if it's $10 and that's all they're providing me, as long as they're providing the next people $10, okay, that's the best we can do. But that sense of fairness in the international development community, or even inside the USAID community, is hard to manage and everything. And from their perspective, again, it's like, hey, how come they're getting taken care of and I'm not, and I'm right over here? So they want to see a sense of fairness that's just close enough that they say, hey, they're all helping us kind of equally. That's okay. It's just like the law and order, you know, when people get, you know, thrown in jail or whatever. They just want a sense of fairness, just like everybody else in the world.
We'll let that be the last word. Please join me in thanking first our microphone wranglers, Rue and Joseph, and also our wonderful panel of experts today. Thank you.